Greetings of peace to all the audience that I have missed since the last session. In this session of the Indigo Firmament, we are going to continue our discussion on the perception of Islam, the historical context. And the idea is that how was Islam as an entity, as an identity, as a religious identity, as a cultural and civilizational identity, perceived by people within the domain of the Muslim world and also from without. So both from within and from without, what was the perception, how it was perceived. This, of course, depends on a lot of factors. We did discuss the earlier period at the time of the Prophet, when Islam was a revolution and reform, that is before the Prophet became a prophet. And then we moved on to the second period, which was the, perhaps we could call it the prophetical era of Islam, both in Mecca and in Medina. And subsequently we moved on to the discussion of the caliphal period of the Khulafa Rashidun. I perhaps, for the sake of a review of what had transpired, we could go back to there one more time. And let me this time make a little distinction between the two aspects of the perception of Islam as a political entity at the time of the four caliphs. So this way the review will not be just a mere review, but sort of review with an addendum. And that is that during this period there was the religious aspect, the polity that was imbued with religious perspective on the one hand, and the polity as a political entity, because obviously the policies that were implemented had both dimensions to them. I think in the formative period of the caliphal period, once the Prophet was no longer as a part of that political equation, the caliphs had to take into their hands the initiative of establishing an ideal state of a republic. This was done in different ways by the four caliphs. At the period of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is generally identified with the establishment of Medina as a state, not as a transient reality that was here today and perhaps would not be there tomorrow. Because that is the aspect that was challenged. And of course this was challenged politically, but the challenge was presented in a religious context. So when we had people who realized that if this Arab by the name of Muhammad could establish such a state and become its political leader and at the same time claim a state of prophethood or prophecy as an endorsement for their political entity, then many of the Arab sheikhs and leaders and tribal chiefs thought that if he could do it, why not they? So they challenged the Medina state, and many of them claimed themselves as prophets, which they thought to be a necessary component for establishing a political reality. And the time of the Caliph Abu Bakr Siddiq, the first Caliph, that was a major challenge, because for many of the Arab tribal chiefs around the Arabian Peninsula, this new phenomenon of the establishment of the Republic of Medina had really not entered the depth of their perception. They thought of it as a tribal alliance and not necessarily a long-term religious mission that was meant to be addressing the ills and wills of humanity. And so this challenge had to be met head on. And so therefore the attempt by the first caliph to meet this challenge head on militarily and politically is often misinterpreted, partly because of the label, that these were battles, or rather battles for people who had, rather they are called the wars of apostasy, Reda, which is incorrect. It's incorrect in the sense that the Quranic command that people are entitled to their opinion, and that there is no coercion in matters of religion, that was accepted, held high, and respected. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq did not fight these people because they had turned away from Islam. He was fighting them because they were challenging the Medina Republic, because they were challenging the Quranic precepts, because they were challenging this new world order, which was bent on ending religious tribalism globally, which was inviting all people to the acceptance of the fact that there is only and only one God. And this one God need not be defined in a religious/tribal context, or perhaps religious, tribal, cultural context, but rather as a universal God. And the universality was not only to be beyond the Arabian Peninsula, but had to be acknowledged and accepted as global, universal, and part of a cosmic reality in essence. So the wars of apostasy is a misnomer, because those were wars that were meeting the challenge of the Arab chiefs head on, who did not want to see the Medina Republic thrive and survive. The second period is that of the second caliph, obviously, and it's only in this period where the second caliph, Omar, was responsible for establishing a state. The Arab states were basically Arab sheikhdoms, or estates and domains of a chief. They did not have the structure of a state, similar to, say, that in Persia or in Byzantium. So Caliph Omar used the Persian and the Byzantium standards of statehood and tried to model this new Islamic state in terms of its, say, bureaucratic structure, if you will, but rather, but also in terms of its operational necessities. Therefore, the establishment of state treasury, for example, the establishment of a standing army, for example, the establishment of a state structure for a judicial system to implement the new teachings of the Quran. So Omar is perhaps single-handedly responsible for establishing that. Of course, the others did help, and the fourth Caliph Ali was very instrumental in contributing to the establishment of the judicial. And so therefore, this period, one can look at it that the perception was positive. For one, that when it was necessary, Omar did act authoritatively. And that distinction has to be made with not authoritarian, but rather authoritative. That when he found injunctions in the Quran that needed to be implemented within the political construct of this new polity, of this new reality, he went head on and implemented them. The interesting thing is that he also was daring enough that when certain provisions that may have been questionable in the eyes of the public who had access to the Quran but were no longer privy to the Prophet himself to clarify, then he took matters into his own hand. For example, a particular interpretation which may or may not have been what it is, in the sense that, at least in the literal sense, the cutting off of the hands of the thieves, for instance. While this matter had to be clarified by jurists eventually in the Muslim world, when Islamic jurisprudence was developed, he took matters into his own hand, that when there was a year of severe drought and starvation, that people had to survive and sometimes had to resort to theft out of necessity for survival, he exempted, or rather suspended, that particular punishment because of the circumstance. And so therefore you could say that this authoritative, commanding voice of the second caliph was very instrumental in making the state of Medina powerful, but within the laws. Unfortunately, this did not last beyond his term of office as caliph, because, again, in my humble opinion, the third caliph, Osman, was perhaps the least capable, or perhaps more vulnerable to sways of loyalties to the various Arab dynasties and so on. And so his government was, and it's often critiqued so, that it was, there were great signs of corruption, let's put it mildly, which eventually led to a rebellion and to his death. Now, yes, we respect all the four caliphs, but respect is one thing. Analyzing them critically, that's a different matter. Then we move on to the time of the fourth caliph, Ali, who was, in addition to being a caliph, also is perceived as an imam. And his period was again challenged, but this time not by Arab chiefs from the peninsula, rather by a very strong and powerful governor from Damascus, which unfortunately ended in the greatest fiasco in the Muslim history of Muslim armies standing face to face against each other. The great calamity, the great catastrophe, the fitna. So Ali would have perhaps continued on Omar's initiatives in many walks of life, because these two are they are perceived as to have been the vanguards of very creative, very imaginative interpretation, understanding, and implementation of the Quranic teaching, not in the theoretical, that is between the pages of the Quran, but rather in the practical, that in the way that would affect the life of an ordinary citizen of an Islamic state at the time. And let me qualify the term Islamic state, that because the term is abused quite often today with the implication that perhaps an Islamic state is a theocracy. This wasn't so in the earlier period. In other words, the state of Medina was established as a republic with a roughly equal participation of the various faith communities that resided in Yathrib or Medina and in its vicinity, that comprised of Muslims, Jews, Christians, and peoples of other faiths. And therefore it was never a theocracy, nor was it meant to be a theocracy, because that contradicts the Quranic edict that there shouldn't be any coercion in matters of faith. And since theocracy by necessity may resort to the implementation of a policy that is based on any particular religion, therefore Islam theoretically cannot accept a theocracy, and therefore it is un-Islamic to establish an Islamic state, because in it, if we assume that that is allowed, then the establishment of an Islamic theocracy is the denial of the basic rights of human beings who may have other preferences, who may have other belief systems, who may have other venues to reach the divine by their own means, to understand God in their own terms, to connect with God based on their own tradition. Islam ideally has always allowed for that. It allowed for that under the Prophet and under the caliphal period of the Rashidun caliphs in Medina. So when I mean to say Islamic state, was that it has to be understood with that proviso. So this would be the review we had. Then we are moving on to the political dimension. And in the political dimension, which is separate from this religious dimension I just explained, is that, yes, political reality, in a sense, establishes its own terms. So yes, during the caliphal period, there were attacks from outside onto the Muslim lands, and vice versa. There were political realities, not only in Arabia, not just in Medina, but further north, both of the Persians and of Byzantium. And those realities necessitated a realistic response in the political. And that cannot be separated, because when we have to analyze things historically, we must be presenting a comprehensive view, not necessarily an idealistic one. And in that comprehensive analysis, yes, the Muslim leaders, the caliphs, the first four caliphs, out of the political realities of their times, interacted with their neighboring states, whether it was Persia or Egypt or Byzantium, based on the reality that was prevailing. And some of those actions, including the battles that were fought, the treaties that were signed, and all the rest of it would be part of a package of a political reality of the time that would be necessitated by the circumstance, not necessarily dictated by the commands of the Quran. So once you establish a state, all these realities come to the fore in their own terms. So we can neither deny them, nor do we have to be apologetic for it. Political reality has and is its own reality, and it dictates certain circumstance. Then, of course, we move on to the Umayyad period, which, as I said in the earlier session, that its emphasis was primarily to establish an Arab empire. Perhaps I exaggerated a little bit there, because it doesn't mean that it was at the exclusion of developing the religious side of it too. Because once you establish an empire, the imperial structure, the imperial outreach, the very essence of that political reality demands that the cultural and perhaps to some degree the civilizational element of it also becomes part of, and for lack of a better term, part of an establishment. So yes, the Umayyads may not have been as pious as we would have liked them to, and again there were exceptions, but in general that period is defined by the global reality of the time, and by global I mean the Eastern Hemisphere only. That there was a struggle, competition, a jockeying for position, that after the fall of the Persian Empire, the vacuum that was created had to be filled, and of course Byzantium wanted to fill that gap as much as the Umayyads would have wanted to. Again, a political reality. So a lot of that expansion that occurred during the Umayyads from say the vicinities of Paris, or at least southern France, to the borders of China in Kashgar and Khotan and Uyghur in that area, further south towards the Indian subcontinent, all would have happened at this time. And again here, if we have to emphasize, yes, the emphasis are more noticeable, or rather the events are more noticeable in terms of the militaristic expansion as an Arab empire. And as I said before, sometimes it's this Umayyad period that is stereotyped into a militaristic expansion, and then the stamp of Islam is put on it. As they say, Islam spread around the world was spread by the sword. And I clarified that last time, and let me emphasize one more time that no, Islam was not spread by the sword, but the Umayyad Empire expanded by the sword, as every other empire has. And that is again another political reality. Now, in the context of that expansion, opportunities were raised for a dialogue, let's say a presentation, an expansion, and an opportunity for other people to get sort of, again for lack of a better term, to get exposed to the principles of this new religion known as Islam. So Islam was part of the component out of a necessity, but it wasn't the main focus of the Umayyads. because their focus, as I said, was the establishment of an Arab empire that had to fill the vacuum. Then the perception, again, at the time would be that yes, there is this new religion, and for those who are outside of it would have been one of curiosity. But it was through these interactions that people realized the egalitarian aspect of Islam as a religion, and how that egalitarian concept was implemented and manifested and presented through the actions and reactions of the people who claimed that. And as they say, the fall of the Persian Empire was not so much the result of the military prowess of the Arabs. Far from it. It was as a result of the fall of the Persians from within, because the people noticed those who lined up against each other in the battlefield. They saw the the fraternity and the egalitarian norms that dominated the Muslim side, and the strict hierarchical power pyramid of the Persian troops, which reflected their affiliation with the caste system, with the different levels of how society was treated. And I think that's why, and also I'm sure there were many other factors, and we don't have time for that in this short discussion, that this is what resulted in the shift of power from the Persians to the Muslims, were the principles of egalitarianism, of a sort of a classless society, as a society with more opportunities, a society that was more inclusive, a social order that provided opportunity for anyone to rise to the top. This open structure of the Muslim state was their main reason for their succession or success, and perhaps the opposite would be true about why the Persians fell, because it was very strict, it was exclusive, it was hierarchical, and it had its own caste system, and along with all of these, it also had the signs of its own political corruption and decay, especially after many years of wars with Byzantium, that I should say many centuries of wars with Byzantium, that was exhausting and exhaustive for the foot soldiers, who would be benefiting the least and paying the most with their lives. So these are the social factors. And since our discussion is on the perception, it was this positive perception of Islam that swayed the momentum from the Persians to the Arabs. So Islam would have been perceived generally as a positive force, not just revolutionary in the context of its theoretical, religious, and philosophical norms, but rather in the implementation of those principles. And one can also look at the psychological aspect of it, that when a religion or an ideology is new, people idealize it a lot. And because they are, in a sense, in it because they want to, because they have been moved. It's a matter of emotions and feelings. And so therefore, this idealization is driven by the human emotions, and therefore people embraced Islam wholeheartedly because it was new ideology, a new principle that was universal, egalitarian, and this new ideology was referring and connecting with the human soul. This was its appeal. This was the reason for its popularity. There is no way that any Arab chief, tribal chief, would have been able to achieve what was achieved if it was a matter of success in the battlefield. Absolutely not. The Arab chiefs were neither militarily prepared, nor did they have armies large enough to bring down huge empires such as the Persian one. So the real momentum was that which ticked in the heart and the minds of the people who were open and receptive to this new revolutionary idea. Today, we see Islam as a religion. Yes, that is and was a part of it. But people then saw Islam as a new wave, as a new revolution. And it was its universality that was appealing to most people. The Umayyads that ruled from roughly 660, 661 to 750 of the Common Era, they had their own period, their own rise and fall and all that. And there was this element of Arabism that slowly crept onto, and that which was ideally universal gradually became more and more Arab. That which was ideally more inclusive became more and more exclusive. And this regression, which was not only in practice but would also soon realized in the in the perception of people who were affected by it, led to a rebellion. And I'm not talking about rebellion in terms of a tribal group or a city or a province, but rather the rebellion was that people realized that the ideals of Islam had been hijacked by the Umayyads, and that there was a need for a revival and return to those universal, inclusive ideals, which then eventually led to the downfall of the Umayyads, at least in Arabia. And of course, they continued to wield power on the Iberian Peninsula when the Umayyad Caliphate was established in Spain. But in Arabia proper, or Southwest Asia, or what is also known as in the Middle East proper, and the power shifted from the Umayyads to the Abbasids. The High Abbasid period was still building on that early momentum. You could look at it either as a revival or resuscitation or reinvigorated new state, which did have its imperial dimensions, politically speaking. But soon the religious side of it on the one hand and the political side of it on the other hand had a competition from its civilizational force. And it's primarily during the Abbasids, the High Abbasids, the early period of the Abbasids, who took over in the year 750 and continued basically until the 1500s, although there were variations and changes along the way. But the Abbasid period would have to be defined as the civilizational Islam. And here, like I said, we have to understand that because of that, the factor I mentioned earlier, that there was no coercion, and that has to be understood in principle, which I'm sure that there must have been many cases where people may have been force converted because of certain political realities, that it's in the human nature. That cannot be denied. But overall, the society was left to their own desire in terms of their religious preferences. So what we know today as Muslim countries, Muslim states, or perhaps more correctly, Muslim majority countries, were not Muslim majority countries for a long time. In other words, Muslims may have been minorities that lived along with Christians, with Zoroastrians, with Coptics in Egypt, and so on. So while the state apparatus may have been led and directed by Muslims under the Abbasids, for example, in the lower echelons of the society, people, their citizens, were not necessarily Muslim majority. And this can be argued from 2 points of view. One, that was the norm in earlier times. The formation of a state as a nation state, which is a European phenomenon, which is in essence a forced assimilation, either ideologically, religiously, or politically. This is a new thing in the human history, which started in Europe. But in the rest of the world, the interest of the ruler in the ruled was only to claim them as their subjects or citizens and collect taxes from them and provide minimal services. And these minimal services that the rulers provide were not based on a kind of social contract that we understand it today. Taxation without representation, for instance. And if I am paying taxes as a citizen, I make demands on my government to provide services in return. And so this modern contract is a more binding one, that the government is supposed to serve the citizens are supposed to provide taxes. So this exchange in the earlier period of human history, now we are talking about 7th, 8th, 9th century, it wasn't that clearly defined. So rulers, let's say, provided certain services, and these were minimal, or they were, for the most part, a showcase type of thing. So a particular ruler would build a big, beautiful mosque, for instance. That will be named after him in some cases, or at least it will be understood such, and so therefore he would find a place in history for himself as the builder of this great mosque, or perhaps the builder of a great university, or a planetarium, or some such thing. So in most cases, these were showcase projects that the rulers undertook in a way to make their own rule, to put their own stamp on the reality of the land that they were ruling over. The services that they may have provided, such as those that we have today, like roads and hospitals and schools, again, they were primarily meant to kind of give a stamp of approval and of recognition in the historical context as to how great a particular leader was. So therefore, with that understanding that there was not necessarily a reciprocal give and take by the citizen and the government, then the governments didn't really have much to do with their citizens in terms of what they believe, what they understand, and so on and so forth. So people were free to follow whatever religion they wanted to. But let's not forget the fact that whatever religion the ruler had definitely had an influence on which religion the citizens or the subjects followed. We saw the case of Constantine's conversion to Christianity, partly because a lot of his soldiers had already become Christians, so he found it necessary within that political reality to himself convert to that so that he could avoid, say, a rebellion by his armed forces. We have similarly on the Muslim side that we had Mongol and Turkic rulers who moved from northern Asia into Central Asia and Southwest Asia that eventually found out that, this land that I have conquered, these people that I have subjected to my orders, they may have vanquished militarily. They are under my command administratively. But when it came to their religious belief system, in many cases the rulers followed the religion of the ruled. As we can see in Central Asia, the earlier kings and rulers had, for example, Turkic and Mongolian names that with the passage of time, their second and third generation rulers had Islamic names. The example that I've probably shared with you before, we had Alp-Tekin and Subuk-Tekin, whose son then becomes Mahmud and Masood and so on. So this transition then implies again that contrary to what we perceive based on our present reality and based on on a major misunderstanding of history, that during the Umayyads and the Abbasids and subsequently for centuries after that, the states that we know as Muslim majority were not Muslim majority states. In other words, the societies were much more pluralistic. And therefore, if the societies eventually became a Muslim majority, that happened very gradually, very slowly, and took centuries and centuries. Now, this is why, the reason I gave you earlier, this is why I'm saying that Islam did not spread by sword, because those who had swords were not interested in people's religious beliefs. Their primary interest was collecting taxes so they could support armies. Their primary interests were in having either standing armies or having agreements with the various tribal confederations to promise them to provide certain number of troops when the rulers were going on their own campaigns. That is the second reason. The other reason, as I said, was that was the norm, not just only in the Muslim lands, but elsewhere too. It wasn't necessarily a matter of coercion, because most of them didn't care. Rulers generally do not care much about religion. The role of Prophet Muhammad would be an exception, because he was a prophet and a head of state. To use Platonic terms, he was a prophet, a philosopher, king, in a sense. But that distinction belongs to very few, and Prophet Muhammad being one, and perhaps there were a few others, but most of them would not fill into that in that box of being understood in both capacities. Political leaders are primarily political leaders, and perhaps political and military leaders, not necessarily religious leaders. So when the Abbasids established their state, the perception of Islam would have been positive. Positive as this new revolutionary force, which is gradually becoming a civilizational one. And the civilizational one is that inclusivity at the social level of the society became an inclusivity in the global level, in the philosophical, in the scientific. And that's something we could discuss further perhaps in the next segment. But it's also important to notice that the Abbasids, as an empire, grew beyond bounds and expanded to farther lands, in some ways, practically speaking, beyond their reach. And it was this expansion that necessitated, by default, the fracturing, that the fracturing lines appeared, and in a short time, either autonomous, semi-autonomous, or perhaps what we could call satellite states evolved and formed, and they expanded in their own rights to the point that they challenged the central authority of the Abbasids in Baghdad. On the Eastern Front, we can see how the Tahirids in Herat established a state, and then we had the in further south in Sistan, the Safarid, and then we had the Samanids in Balkh. So most of the formation of these states were in a gradual and step-by-step way. Each one became more and more independent of Baghdad, and the role of Baghdad as that central monolithic super empire gradually diminished. And this was understood because of a certain reality, that this gravitational element of the increased populations in these far extended lands contributed to that. So that if you had to measure it by how many citizens, how many people, how many cities and townships were, say, under the control of the Samanids in Balkh, in some ways they would either equal or perhaps even outweigh those of Baghdad. Then, of course, we had similar developments on the West, And as we saw historically speaking, again, the expansion in the West was such that we had, in addition to the Abbasids, we had the Umayyads expanding in Spain, and then we had the Fatimids in Egypt, who also took in the Levant and in the Maghreb, who challenged both the Abbasids in the east and the Umayyads in the west. So the Fatimids became an entity in their own right in North Africa and in Egypt. And of course, we had the Ghaznavids, who then moved perhaps more center stage into Ghazni and established a state that spanned between Persia and India at the time. And so therefore, the Abbasids, in a sense, provided a model. And this was a model of inclusivity and a civilizational force, and the competitiveness element within this was not so much the competition between the Achaemenids of Persia and the Greeks, and it was not the Byzantium and the Persians who competed in the battlefield, and these battles were going on for centuries, devastating and destroying both sides. In other words, it wasn't a destructive competition like those between the Persians and Byzantium, but rather it was a constructive and a positive competition. That in this positive competition, the various Muslim states, and here we are primarily talking about the Umayyads of Spain, the Fatimids of North Africa, the Abbasids in the center stage in Baghdad. We are talking about Samanids in Balkh and the Ghaznavids in Ghazni. So they all became competitive, positivistic, competitive forces and empires and states that kind of establishes the norm for that positive perception we are talking about. Obviously, we haven't finished this discussion, so in the next segment, we will continue on the same theme. And until then, we bid you farewell and have a nice day.